The thunderstorm arrived without warning, rolling over the ridge and breaking across the small farming town with the kind of violence people remembered for years afterward. The sky darkened quickly, sheets of rain hammering the tin roofs and rattling the windows until voices were raised just to be heard inside. Power lines sparked and went dark across the valley, leaving only flashes of lightning to illuminate the rows of fields and scattered barns that dotted the countryside. It was the kind of night people usually stayed indoors, doors locked, radios tuned to weather reports that never seemed fast enough to keep up. In the chaos of that evening, a girl went missing. She was 12 years old, old enough to have some independence, but still young enough to be told where to go when storms came through. Witnesses would later say she was last seen running across the yard toward her family's barn, her small figure darting through sheets of rain, her hair plastered against her face as thunder cracked overhead. The barn had always been a place of comfort, a shelter for animals and tools, a space where the dog usually curled up when storms frightened him. No one thought she wouldn't come back. Her disappearance was first noticed only after the storm began to ease. Neighbors recalled that the family's dog barked frantically, louder and more desperate than usual, then suddenly went silent. Some thought the sound was muffled by the thunder. Others said it was cut short, an abrupt end that lingered in memory. When the rain thinned and people ventured outside to check fences and power lines, they expected to see the girl emerge, wet but safe, maybe holding the dog's collar, as she often did. But she was nowhere to be found. The girl's parents searched the barn first, certain she would be hiding in the hayloft or crouched behind stacked bales, waiting for the storm to pass. They called her name into the damp air, voices carrying through the open door and echoing against the wood beams. The only response was dripping water and the creak of the storm-battered structure. No footprints were visible in the mud, no clear trail leading away from the barn. It was as if she had vanished in the narrow gap of time when the storm was at its loudest and everyone was inside, waiting for it to break. Within the hour, neighbors joined the search, spreading out with flashlights and lanterns as the last of the thunder moved east. They combed the ditches and tree lines, calling her name again and again into the soaked fields. Some walked the banks of the swollen creek, shining lights into the current, afraid of what they might find. Others checked sheds and porches, believing she might have taken shelter wherever she could. Each group returned empty-handed, their voices quieter each time they reappeared at the farmhouse, shaking their heads, rainwater running off their clothes. The search extended late into the night, long after the power was restored in parts of town. By then, word had spread quickly. People knew the girl, knew her family, knew the barn she had run toward. The details didn't make sense, and that uncertainty made the fear sharper. A storm could explain confusion, but storms didn't erase people. The dog's barking had been the last sound connected to her, and its sudden silence left questions no one could answer in the darkness of that night. As dawn broke, the barn stood quiet, doors half open, straw scattered across the floor from the wind that had forced its way inside. Neighbors said the place felt wrong, too still for what it had meant only hours before. The parents walked the property over and over, mud clinging to their boots, eyes scanning for any sign that might explain how a child could vanish between one thunderclap and the next. Their exhaustion was visible. But Neither of them stopped moving, as if standing still might allow the reality to settle too heavily. The official call for assistance went out soon after sunrise. Law enforcement notified that a child was missing under strange circumstances. But even before deputies arrived, the sense of dread had already spread beyond the family. This wasn't just a storm that had passed through, leaving broken branches and flooded fields behind. It was the beginning of something heavier, something people could feel, even without evidence. The girl had disappeared during a thunderstorm, and as the valley dried under the weak morning sun, no one could yet explain how. And so, the first night ended not with answers, but with a question that would never fully leave the town. How does a 12-year-old girl vanish in plain sight, within reach of her home, while her dog cries out into the storm and then falls silent? It was only the beginning of what would become a search that stretched far beyond that field, but already a chilling thought lingered. If the storm had hidden her, then what had kept her hidden when the rain was gone? By the morning after the storm, the town had already begun to move in unison. Calls were made before dawn, and by mid-morning, deputies, fire crews, and dozens of volunteers were lined up outside the farmhouse. The girl's name carried weight in the community. Everyone knew her family, and knew the land where she had vanished. It was the kind of place where people looked out for each other, and the shock of a child gone missing in her own yard made it impossible to stay home. The sheriff's office coordinated the effort, drawing up search grids on paper maps, dividing farmland woods and creek lines into sectors. It was the kind of operation people usually associated with natural disasters, but here it was triggered by a single disappearance. The first theory people clung to was the creek. Heavy rain had pushed its banks past normal limits, water rushing harder than anyone had seen in years. Deputies believed she might have slipped, drawn toward the water during the storm, her small body carried downstream in minutes. Searchers walked the muddy edges carefully, poles in hand, to prod the swollen current, eyes scanning for any trace of clothing or hair. Others checked culverts and bridges where debris often piled after a surge. The silence that followed each check grew heavier because nothing surfaced, not even a scrap of fabric. By afternoon, attention shifted. The barn was searched again, this time methodically. Deputies swept the hayloft, crawled under floorboards, checked feed bins, and cleared the tack room. Volunteers formed a circle around the building, moving slowly outward in a tightening grid, watching every patch of grass, every ditch, every hollow. They were trained to look for disturbances, broken branches, bent grass, footprints in soft ground. But rain had erased most signs, washing away tracks and scent trails, leaving only soaked earth that told nothing of the night before. Cadaver dogs were brought in from a neighboring county, handlers leading them directly to the barn. At first, the animals reacted strongly, noses pressing into the dirt near the south door, tails stiff, bodies tense. They pawed at the ground and circled in tight loops, indicating the presence of human scent. But just as quickly as the signal came, it vanished. The dogs pulled handlers out into the field, only to wander aimlessly, confused, their heads lifting as if the trail had dissolved into thin air. Handlers explained that heavy rain could scatter or wash away scent, leaving only fragments too weak to follow. It was both a clue and a frustration. The barn had meaning, but beyond it, there was nothing solid to hold on to. Theories multiplied in the absence of evidence. Some searchers whispered that the storm had been a perfect cover for someone passing through. A stranger could have waited for the moment the power went out, approached unnoticed, and taken her before anyone stepped outside. Deputies questioned the possibility of a vehicle pulling into the field, but the saturated ground showed no tire marks, no deep ruts. Others insisted she must still be on the property, hidden in a hollow or brush pile no one had yet uncovered. The sheriff reminded them to stay systematic. No corner left unchecked, no ditch ignored. Volunteers pushed through thickets, some cutting with machetes, others crawling on hands and knees to peer into holes animals had dug. Every depression in the ground became a potential clue. Flashlights swept through culverts under the road, while farm ponds were probed with long poles. Helicopters flew overhead, their spotlights cutting across the fields in wide arcs. At night, the search didn't stop. Portable lights were set up around the barn, the glow stretching into the darkness, a beacon that marked the center of the mystery. Families rotated shifts, refusing to rest until the girl was found. But after 48 hours, exhaustion began to show. Deputies' voices grew sharper, tempers flared among volunteers, and the family watched in silence from their porch, too drained to speak. Theories about abduction grew louder. Some pointed to a pickup truck seen on a nearby road that night, its driver never identified. Others wondered if someone familiar with the family had taken advantage of the storm, slipping in and out without leaving a trace. The absence of answers fed suspicion, and suspicion began to fracture trust. Still, the official narrative held. All options remained open. Detectives interviewed neighbors repeatedly, piecing together timelines measured in minutes and lightning strikes. Did anyone hear a scream? Did anyone see movement near the barn after the barking stopped? The answers were always uncertain, blurred by the noise of the storm and the shock of hindsight. Each retelling left investigators with more doubt than clarity. By the end of the first week, the grid search covered miles of terrain. Every ditch, every hollow, every stretch of woods within 2 miles had been walked by boots or scanned by helicopter. Nothing had been overlooked, and yet not a single item was recovered. No clothing, no shoes, no trace of the girl who had run into the rain. The barn remained the center point of the search, but it offered no secrets, only silence. It was the silence that weighed most heavily. In a community accustomed to finding lost livestock, tracking deer through brush, or following a child's footprints in fresh snow, the absence of a trail felt unnatural. It was as if the storm had taken her and left no evidence she had ever stood on that ground. Theories were all anyone had, but even theories began to run thin when day after day yielded nothing. By then, hope had shifted into something harder, quieter. People stopped asking when she would be found and started asking how. The unanswered question lingered like the scent the dogs had caught and lost, a trace of truth buried beneath rain-soaked soil. And with every failed sweep, suspicion deepened that this disappearance was not an accident of weather, but something darker concealed beneath the ordinary landscape. In the days that followed the failed search grids, the family's farmhouse became both the center of concern and the subject of quiet speculation. At first, neighbors brought casseroles and blankets. filling the kitchen with sympathetic voices and promises that the girl would be found soon. But as the hours turned into days, and the days stretched toward weeks, the warmth began to thin. Each knock at the door carried questions more than comfort. People wanted to know what really happened that night, and with no answers from investigators, eyes naturally turned toward the family itself. The father held to one explanation with unwavering certainty. Their daughter must have wandered into the woods during the storm, disoriented by lightning and thunder, and was now hidden somewhere the search teams had somehow missed. He walked the property alone after the volunteers left, pushing deeper into the trees with nothing more than a flashlight, convinced he would stumble across her calling back to him. His insistence became more desperate with each fruitless night, as if by believing hard enough he could will the search into success. The mother, by contrast, rejected the notion of her daughter lost to the woods. She clung to the idea of abduction, convinced someone had taken advantage of the storm to lure or snatch her away. She replayed every detail, recalling headlights that had passed their road, an unfamiliar pickup parked at a distance days earlier, or strangers seen at the feed store. To her, the silence of the barn and the dogs barking ending so abruptly pointed to something human, not nature. She pressed deputies to follow up on every lead, no matter how thin, while privately confessing to friends she feared someone close had been involved. This divide in belief began to grow between them, a crack that widened with each passing day. Arguments erupted late at night, when they thought no one could hear, the father angry at the suggestion that someone had slipped onto their land, the mother angry that he refused to see what she considered obvious. Each theory became a battleground, and each battleground pushed them further apart. The loss of their daughter was a wound neither could treat, and the blame began to seep into the space between them. Rumors from outside the home only fueled the fracture. Some whispered that a relative had been near the property that night, someone who knew the land and the barn better than anyone. A few claimed they had seen a familiar figure moving in the rain, though no one could agree on who. Others said the family's accounts of the storm shifted too often, that details changed depending on who was asking. Deputies noted these inconsistencies in their reports, small variations that might mean nothing, but to a community starved for answers, they began to feel like smoke pointing to a hidden fire. Law enforcement quietly examined the possibility of someone inside the family holding back information. It was routine in missing child cases to scrutinize those closest, but here the tension between the parents made the scrutiny sharper. The father's late-night searches in the woods raised questions about whether he was chasing hope or covering something he knew. The mother's insistence on abduction drew suspicion that she was deflecting from another truth. Detectives asked the same questions in different ways, looking for cracks in the stories told, and each round of interviews only added pressure to an already fractured household. The wider community began to pull back. Where once neighbors had crowded the porch, now they kept their distance, speaking in lowered tones at church or in line at the post office. Sympathy gave way to doubt. Families who had once offered to help with meals now speculated whether the truth of the disappearance lay not in the fields or woods, but inside the home itself. The farmhouse, once a gathering point, grew quiet, curtains drawn tight. The air inside heavy with silence broken only by unanswered phone calls from reporters. The girl's bedroom remained untouched, a shrine of sorts, her belongings frozen in place as if she might return at any moment. For her mother, it was a space to preserve hope. For her father, it was a painful reminder that nothing had changed despite all his searching. The contrast deepened their divide, her gaze fixed on the idea of a stranger's crime, his fixed on the belief of an overlooked accident. Neither could bend, and that rigidity left them more isolated from each other than from the world outside. Investigators pressed forward, but each new interview with the family only produced more tension. Deputies noted how often the father cut off questions, how the mother's eyes welled at specific names but hardened at others. Theories swirled, yet no evidence ever materialized to confirm them. In the absence of proof, suspicion filled the void, and, while the case itself stalled, the fracture within the family widened into something permanent. By the end of the second week, the public sympathy had shifted toward unease. The disappearance was no longer seen only as a mystery hidden by the storm, but also as a secret the family might be keeping. And as investigators quietly turned their focus inward, the larger question settled heavily over the valley. If the girl hadn't been taken by the storm, then who had taken her, and why did the answers always circle back to the people who should have loved her most? Tips began pouring in within days of her disappearance, the kind of desperate flood investigators expected but never fully trusted. Calls came from across the county, sightings of a girl walking along the roadside, a child matching her description in a nearby town, even whispers of someone dragging a bundle through the rain that night. Each tip was logged, followed, and tested against what little evidence existed, and each one collapsed under scrutiny. The lead that seemed most promising early on came from a neighbor who swore he had seen an old pickup truck parked along the dirt road near the property during the height of the storm. The timing was suspicious, the details specific enough to draw attention. Deputies canvassed the area, trying to match the description to known vehicles. They interviewed farmhands, loggers, and drifters who sometimes passed through in beat-up trucks. But every potential match carried an alibi, and the one vehicle they briefly held for inspection yielded no evidence connecting it to the girl. The neighbor admitted under pressure that he hadn't written down the plate, only thought he remembered the color. What began as a glimmer of possibility ended as another dead end. That failure gave more room for whispers to grow. Around town, theories spread in coffee shops and church basements. Some said lightning had struck too close to the barn, terrifying her into running blindly into the fields. They claimed the storm itself swallowed her, the noise and chaos making it impossible to track where she went. Others doubted nature's role. They pointed back to the family, noting how odd it was that no one inside the house had seen her enter the barn, how the father's story always emphasized the woods, while the mother insisted on abduction. To the outside world, these weren't just differences in belief. They were cracks that looked like secrets. Detectives tried to sift through these rumors with patience, but resources stretched thin. They followed up on stories of strangers in town, men seen at gas stations or leaning against bar counters who didn't belong. They checked motel registries, asking clerks if they remembered anyone checking in during the storm. Nothing tied back to her. In the absence of evidence, rumors hardened into something people repeated as fact, even when it wasn't. The line between speculation and testimony blurred. The barn itself became the center of a different kind of story. Some residents swore they had always felt something uneasy about it, that it had an isolated quality, even when full of life. They claimed it was strange the cadaver dogs had alerted them before losing the trail. A few went so far as to suggest that whatever had happened that night had happened inside those walls, and that someone had hidden the truth long enough for the rain to wash away the proof. Deputies denied it publicly, insisting the barn had been searched thoroughly, but privately some admitted the structure left them unsettled. There were corners and beams where light never seemed to reach. Each week that passed added weight to the silence. Flyers that once carried her smiling face began to curl on telephone poles, edges darkened by weather. Families who had joined the search returned to their routines, though conversation still circled back to her name when they thought no one was listening. Reporters stopped returning calls, leaving only a few lines in regional papers when new leads fizzled out. What had begun with urgency was slowing into something heavier, the slow crawl of a cold case. The father refused to give up his nightly searches, trudging into the woods with a lantern, even as neighbors shook their heads. The mother, meanwhile, pressed detectives to focus on abduction, handing over lists of names she thought worth investigating. Both paths hit walls. The woods gave nothing back. The deputies had no suspect they could hold. Every theory ended in the same emptiness the search grids had produced, and yet the community could not let the story rest. Some whispered that lightning had not only scared her, but struck her directly. Her body buried beneath fallen branches no one had cleared. Others leaned into darker possibilities, suggesting someone in the family knew exactly where she had gone and had silenced her cries before the storm ended. These were rumors without evidence, but they spread all the same, because mystery demanded explanation and absence demanded blame. By the time the second month closed, the investigation had hit a wall. No new evidence, no suspects, no discoveries to revive momentum. The case file thickened with reports that led nowhere, tips that had been run down and discarded. For detectives, it was the hollowing stage of a missing child investigation, the slow recognition that answers might not come. For the family, it was another wound layered on top of the first, the realization that the town no longer saw them as only victims, but possibly as keepers of a secret. What began as a storm had turned into a shadow over the valley. And as silence settled deeper into the farmhouse and across the community, one question rose louder than all the rest. If the truth wasn't in the creek, the woods, or the town, was it still hidden in the barn itself, waiting for time to uncover what the storm had once concealed? The first year after the storm carried with it a strange rhythm of waiting. At first, the house stayed full, neighbors visiting daily, casseroles left on the porch, reporters calling with questions, detectives stopping by with updates that never seemed to amount to more than reassurance. The parents clung to the sound of cars crunching up the gravel drive, even if the visits brought little comfort. But as months passed with no sign of their daughter, the visits slowed, the voices faded, and the farmhouse began to settle into a silence broken only by the ticking of a clock in the hallway and the low bark of the dog who had been the last to hear her that night. Her bedroom was never altered. The bed remained neatly made, the curtains drawn halfway, the small lamp still sitting on the nightstand with a book open beneath it. To the mother, it was proof of hope, evidence that her daughter still had a place to come home to. To the father, it became an ache he couldn't bear to enter, a room that smelled of dust and memory, but no longer of life. The untouched space stood as a reminder to anyone who visited that she had not simply been forgotten. Each anniversary of her disappearance brought a gathering. In the first few years, hundreds of people filled the churchyard and lined the main street with candles, holding vigils that glowed against the darkened horizon. Children carried photographs of her, classmates scribbled messages on poster boards, and pastors spoke of endurance and faith. Detectives gave brief remarks promising the investigation was ongoing, that leads were still being pursued. But as the years stacked one upon another, the crowds grew smaller, the candles fewer, and the promises shorter. What had once united the town slowly became an uncomfortable ritual, too painful for some to continue, too unresolved for others to abandon completely. The case file thickened with each passing year, but little within its pages changed. Detectives rotated in and out, each new investigator starting with fresh determination, combing through old interviews, re-examining photographs of the barn, redrawing timelines of the storm. Each believed they might notice what their predecessors had missed, but the trail was always the same, washed away by rain, blurred by rumor, and cold before it ever had a chance to warm. The longer the silence lasted, the more the case began to feel less like an investigation and more like a story told and retold, each telling stripped of certainty. The family adjusted in different ways. The father retreated into work, throwing himself into the land with mechanical repetition, avoiding conversation about the storm altogether. He refused to attend the vigils, claiming they were little more than reminders of failure. The mother attended everyone, standing near the front, holding a candle until the wax burned into her hand. She kept contact with detectives, phoning the sheriff's office whenever a new name surfaced. Whenever someone thought they'd seen a girl who looked familiar in a distant town. Every call ended the same way, with apologies and explanations that the lead had gone nowhere. Yet she refused to stop believing the truth lay just beyond reach. Over time, the storm itself became legend. People told it to newcomers who settled in the valley, a cautionary tale of how quickly a life could vanish. Children whispered about it during sleepovers, daring each other to walk to the old barn in the dark, swearing they heard the dogs bark, echoing through the trees when thunder rolled. Farmers mentioned it in passing when new storms struck, lowering their voices as though the night had left a permanent scar on the land. It was no longer just a family's tragedy, it had become folklore, woven into the identity of the town. Yet behind the folklore was a persistent unease. The unanswered questions never fully faded, even as time dulled their sharpness. The image of the girl running toward the barn lingered, a detail repeated so often it was imprinted on memory. The silence that followed her dog's barking was carried like a riddle no one could solve. Some believed the truth would eventually surface. That time had a way of unearthing secrets. Others accepted that it might remain hidden forever, buried with the storm itself. By the 10th anniversary, only a handful of people attended the vigil. The churchyard was nearly empty, the candles fewer than the stars above. Detectives no longer offered public updates. The case was still open, but no longer active. It had been folded into the drawer of cold cases, a file waiting for the unlikely chance that something new would appear. For the family, the ritual had become less about hope and more about endurance, an act of refusal to let her vanish entirely from the record of time. The farmhouse stood quiet on most days, the barn leaning in the distance, weathered and sagging under years of neglect. It was still spoken of in whispers, as if the walls themselves knew something no one else did. And, though 12 years passed without answers, the shadow of that night never lifted, because in the back of every mind lingered the same thought. If the storm had hidden her, then somewhere, somehow, the storm had also hidden the truth. 12 years after the storm, the case stirred back to life with a single phone call. A shelter director in another state reported a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to the girl who had vanished all those years ago. She was in her 20s, but her face carried features that matched the old flyers still pinned on a bulletin board in the sheriff's office. The shelter staff had noticed scars on her arms, and when asked about her past, she gave vague answers, offering a name no one could confirm. The tip was different from the dozens that had come before. It was specific, detailed, and accompanied by a photograph. For the first time in over a decade, investigators felt a spark of cautious hope. Detectives immediately contacted the family. The mother, who had never stopped believing in abduction, clutched at the possibility with a desperate kind of faith. She insisted this was the lead she had been waiting for, the explanation for all those silent years. The father was more guarded, worn down by too many dead ends to allow himself optimism. Still, he agreed to travel if the woman proved to be their daughter. The sheriff's office coordinated with authorities in the other state, and arrangements were made for DNA testing. The process moved quickly, expedited because of the history tied to the case. Swabs were collected, samples shipped, and analysts placed the test at the top of the queue. While results were pending, detectives reviewed the old file once again, revisiting photographs of the farmhouse, the barn, and the search grids laid out on soaked maps. They knew the odds were slim. Most leads failed. But there was enough similarity in the photograph to leave everyone on edge. For the family, it was 12 years of grief and doubt pressing into a single moment of possibility. When the results arrived, the answer was crushing. The DNA did not match. The woman in the shelter was not the girl who had disappeared during the storm. She was someone else entirely. Her scars the result of a different history. Her silence a shield against her own past. She had nothing to do with the night that had haunted the valley. Investigators delivered the news with the practiced gentleness that came from experience, but for the family, the hope that had briefly lifted them collapsed harder than before. The mother wept openly, insisting the test was wrong, begging for retesting, while the father stood silent, hands pressed into his knees, his face unreadable. For detectives, the failed lead brought them back to the same unanswered questions. Privately, some admitted what they had always struggled with. The barn search had never made sense. Cadaver dogs had alerted near the doors in the days after the disappearance, but nothing had ever been found inside. The structure had been combed repeatedly, from hayloft to feed bins to crawl spaces beneath the floor. Deputies had walked through shoulder to shoulder, their flashlights cutting through the shadows, but the search yielded nothing. Years later, investigators confessed they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been overlooked, that the barn itself had kept its secret hidden through rain, mud, and rumor. The case file returned to its drawer, thicker now only by a few more pages. The shelter lead was added to the long list of tips that had gone nowhere, a reminder of how time stretched the gap between truth and memory. Yet, unlike other dead ends, this one reopened an unease that had never settled. If the girl wasn't alive somewhere, if the storm hadn't swept her away, then where had she gone in that short space between her last steps toward the barn and the silence that followed? For the family, the unanswered question settled deeper than ever. Hope had been briefly rekindled, only to be extinguished again, leaving them with the same void that had marked every day since the storm. But even in disappointment, one detail lingered across every conversation, whispered quietly among detectives when the family couldn't hear. Something about the barn had never sat right, and if the truth wasn't in another state, it might still be buried closer to home, waiting for the right moment to surface. 12 years after the storm that had taken her, another storm rolled through the valley, this one carrying winds strong enough to tear apart what time and weather had already weakened. The old barn, long abandoned and sagging on its foundation, finally gave way, its roof peeled back, its beams split. And by morning, it was nothing more than a pile of collapsed timber and rusted tin scattered across the field. For most people, it was just another casualty of weather, but for those who lived nearby, the sight of the barn lying broken stirred memories that had never really settled. Neighbors came quickly, some to help clear debris, others out of quiet curiosity. The family had stopped using the barn years earlier, letting it rot. After the night their daughter had vanished, its fall was almost symbolic, a landmark erased. But as they pulled at broken boards and shifted heavy beams, one neighbor noticed something strange beneath the rubble. It wasn't wood or tin, but a flash of color against the soil, partly hidden beneath rotted straw. At first, it looked like a scrap of fabric, but as they brushed away dirt, the outline became unmistakable. It was a shoe, small, worn, the kind a child would wear. The discovery stopped everything. Voices lowered, hands froze in place, and one of the men told the others not to touch anything further. A call was made to the sheriff's office, and within an hour, deputies arrived, setting up tape around the fallen structure. What had begun as cleanup turned into a crime scene. The family watched from the porch, their expressions caught between shock and resignation, as if part of them had always expected the barn to hold something back. Investigators moved carefully through the wreckage, treating each piece of debris as potential evidence. They marked sections with flags, photographed every angle, and worked methodically, despite the pressure that built with each discovery. The shoe was bagged, its faded fabric and broken lace cataloged. Its size and style matched what the girl had been wearing the night she disappeared. That single object reopened a case long considered unsolvable. And it did so in the place everyone thought had been searched thoroughly years earlier. As excavation continued, deputies uncovered more items. A rusted metal box half buried beneath the foundation, contained scraps of fabric and what appeared to be an old ribbon. Nearby, bones from small animals surfaced, at first confusing the scene, but the investigators pressed deeper, aware that time and decay could easily mix what was once separate. Every layer peeled back, heightened tension. Each beam removed seemed to carry the weight of 12 years of unanswered questions. The mother stood at the edge of the tape, her hands pressed to her face, whispering words no one else could hear. The father stood back from the crowd, his arms crossed tightly, staring at the ground, as if trying to brace himself for what might come next. For both of them, the barn's collapse was not just the destruction of wood and nails, but the tearing open of something they had lived beside for more than a decade, never knowing or never admitting what might lie inside. Detectives reminded the press that nothing was confirmed yet, but privately, they admitted the implications were impossible to ignore. A child's shoe beneath the collapsed barn meant the search had missed something, or something had been hidden too well for them to find. Theories shifted quickly. Had the storm that night trapped her inside? Had someone placed her belongings there after the fact? Was the barn not just a backdrop to her disappearance, but the place where it had ended? By dusk, the site was fully sealed. Floodlights were brought in to continue work through the evening, deputies taking turns sifting through mud and debris. Every nail, every board was checked, bagged, and recorded. The longer they worked, the more unsettling the silence became. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew what they were expecting to find. The barn, once a landmark of ordinary farm life, had turned into a place of dread. Its fall had exposed not only the fragility of wood, but the possibility that the truth of that storm 12 years earlier had never been far away at all. And as investigators prepared to dig deeper beneath the ruins, the question pressing against everyone's chest was no longer if the girl had passed through the barn that night, but whether she had never left it. The barn site was transformed overnight from a pile of collapsed wood to a controlled excavation. Deputies called in forensic specialists from the state, teams trained to treat old structures and soil the way archaeologists handled ruins. By dawn, the wreckage was under a wide canopy, plastic sheets anchored to protect the ground from rain and wind. Investigators moved slowly, their gloved hands brushing through hay and dirt, every piece of timber cataloged before being lifted away. It wasn't just a collapsed building anymore. It was a crime scene, 12 years delayed. At first, they uncovered only fragments of the barn's history. Broken nails, rusted hinges, glass from old lanterns, and tools too corroded to identify. Each object was bagged, photographed, and mapped. But beneath the heavy beams, the soil changed. Layers of hay and straw, compressed over years, gave way to patches of darker earth. It was there that one of the specialists paused, her brush revealing the outline of something that wasn't wood or stone. Thin, pale, and curved. At first, it might have been mistaken for animal bone, but as more of it emerged, the dimensions told another story. Word spread quickly among the team. Skeletal remains had been found. They were small, far too small to belong to an adult. The silence that followed was immediate, every voice dropping as the brushstrokes grew more careful, more deliberate, piece by piece. The shape of a ribcage came into view, delicate bones tangled with dirt and straw. Nearby, fragments of fabric were uncovered, too degraded to identify, but still clinging faintly to the soil. The shoe found the day before no longer stood alone. This was confirmation of what many had feared, but never been able to prove. The discovery pulled the family back into the center of everything. Deputies shielded them from the sight, but word was impossible to soften. The mother collapsed against a neighbor, her hands clutching at air, as if she could hold back what was being revealed. The father stood rigid, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the ground, saying nothing. For them, the barn was no longer just the place she had run to on the night of the storm. It was now the place where she had been lost forever. Investigators pressed deeper, expanding the excavation in careful sections. More skeletal remains surfaced, consistent with those of a child approximately the same age as the girl when she vanished. Forensic anthropologists noted the size of the bones, the stages of development, the way certain fractures suggested trauma rather than simple collapse. Still, nothing was stated officially. Every fragment was collected, every position recorded. The team determined to preserve as much information as time had left behind. As they cleared more debris, another discovery shifted the investigation further. Against the far wall, buried beneath collapsed boards, they uncovered rusted tools, an old hammer, a broken scythe, and several lengths of chain tangled in the dirt. The tools themselves might have meant nothing. Ordinary farm equipment left behind when the barn was abandoned, but their placement so near the remains drew unease. Detectives could not ignore the implication that the space had been more than storage. Then came the most unsettling find. Beneath a section of flooring that had given way in the collapse, a square outline appeared, framed by rotted beams. As boards were removed, investigators realized it was a trapdoor, concealed for years beneath hay bales and farm clutter. Hinges nearly fused with rust gave way under careful pressure, revealing a dark shaft leading down into a root cellar, long forgotten. Air rose from it, stale and heavy, carrying the smell of soil that had not been disturbed in decades. The cellar was shallow, only a few feet deep, its floor lined with stone. But the knowledge that it had existed just beneath the family's feet during the original search was a revelation in itself. The cellar walls showed no obvious signs of what had happened there, but the fact that it had been overlooked 12 years earlier left investigators shaken. Cadaver dogs had alerted near this very spot, and yet the trapdoor had remained hidden, shielded by debris and darkness. Detectives privately admitted that the storm and rushed searches of those first days might have allowed something critical to slip past, unnoticed. Now, time has given them another chance. The site was sealed completely after that. No one but forensic personnel were allowed within the perimeter. Every inch was photographed, every object tagged. The remains were prepared for transport to the state lab, where DNA testing and bone analysis would confirm identity and possibly cause of death. The tools were bagged, the trapdoor measured and studied, the soil beneath it sifted inch by inch for any further trace of evidence. Neighbors who had once whispered theories now stood in silence at the edge of the tape, watching floodlights bathe the ruins in harsh brightness. For 12 years, the barn had stood as an unanswered question. Now, with its collapse, it has spoken. But as the remains were lifted gently from the earth and carried away, one thought pressed heavily on every heart. If this was indeed her, then someone had known all along where she was hidden. The remains were transported to the state crime lab, under tight security, every movement documented as if the bones themselves carried answers too fragile to lose. Weeks passed before the report was delivered, but when it came, there was no room for doubt. DNA confirmed the skeletal remains belonged to the 12-year-old girl who had vanished during the thunderstorm 12 years earlier. The case that had haunted the valley was no longer a mystery of where. Her body had been inside the barn all along, but the report carried details that complicated what many had assumed for over a decade. Anthropologists examining the bones noted fractures inconsistent with a simple accident. They weren't the result of collapse, nor the random injuries of a child falling in the dark. The breaks were sharp, deliberate, and appeared to have occurred before death. Blunt force trauma. It meant she hadn't simply been trapped in the storm, she had been struck. For investigators, that single finding shifted the case from tragedy to crime. The discovery of her necklace only deepened the unease. It was found wedged between stones in the floor of the root cellar beneath the trapdoor. The clasp was broken, the chain bent as if it had been torn from her neck rather than slipped free. Her parents identified it immediately. It had been a birthday gift only weeks before she disappeared. The presence of the necklace in the cellar raised disturbing questions. Had she been forced down there? Had someone hidden her body and belongings deliberately, sealing the trapdoor before the first searchers ever entered the barn? Detectives revisited the original search files, their pages now painful reminders of what had been missed. In those early days, the cadaver dogs had circled the barn, alerting, only to lose the trail. The root cellar, concealed beneath rotted boards and hay, had never been uncovered. Investigators privately admitted it was possible she had been beneath their feet all along, while the search spread into fields and creeks. The storm, once seen as the culprit, now looked more like a shield that had hidden something darker. Attention turned once again to the family. Detectives re-interviewed relatives, focusing on who had access to the barn on the night of the storm. One name surfaced repeatedly, a relative who had helped with farm work, someone who knew the structure, knew where tools were kept, knew about the hidden trapdoor that others had forgotten. Witnesses recalled this person being near the property that evening, though no one could place them at the critical moment when the girl vanished. Suspicion began to circle tightly around them, but after so many years, evidence was thin and memories blurred. The mother's grief hardened into something sharper as the report spread. For years, she had insisted her daughter had been taken, and now she felt vindicated, but also hollowed out. The truth was worse than anything she had imagined. The father withdrew further, avoiding interviews, retreating into silence. Some investigators noted his refusal to speak as suspicious, while others saw it as the collapse of a man whose final defense, that it had been an accident of the storm, had been stripped away. The town, once quiet on the matter, erupted again in whispers. People remembered arguments, feuds, or odd behaviors from years earlier, retrofitting them into possible motives. Some swore they had always suspected someone close, that the storm had been too convenient a cover. Others questioned how so many searches, so many trained eyes could have missed what now seemed obvious. Folklore turned to accusation, and accusation hardened into collective unease. Detectives pushed the case forward, but progress was slow. Physical evidence degraded by time offered few clear answers. The fractures proved violence, but not intent. The necklace proved presence, but not who had broken it. The trapdoor proved concealment, but not the hands that had closed it. What remained was a tangled web of suspicion focused on those who had known the barn best. And, within that narrow circle, the family itself stood at the center. The forensic report gave the valley what it had waited 12 years for, confirmation. But it also stripped away the comfort of believing the girl had been lost to weather or chance. She had not been carried off by the storm. She had been struck, hidden, and left beneath the barn, where her family and neighbors walked past her countless times. And, as detectives faced the grim weight of those facts, one question pressed louder than all others. If her final moments were inside the barn, then who, among those closest to her, had ensured she would never leave it alive? The final report was written in precise clinical language, but its conclusions carried a weight no wording could soften. The girl had died inside the barn on the night of the thunderstorm. Her body, hidden in the root cellar beneath rotted boards and hay, had remained there undisturbed for 12 years, until the collapse exposed what the search teams had missed. The storm had not swept her away, nor had she wandered into the woods as once believed. She had never left the property at all. The official explanation ended there, but the details within the report suggested more than just tragedy. Forensic evidence showed fractures to her bones that pointed to blunt force trauma, not the randomness of accident or weather. The broken necklace lodged in the cellar floor told of a struggle, an act that was deliberate, not incidental, and the presence of tools and chains nearby hinted at concealment rather than discovery. Together, these details painted a picture investigators could not ignore. What happened that night was not random. Behind closed doors, detectives admitted their suspicion. They believed someone with access to the barn had placed her in the cellar, covering the trapdoor before searchers ever arrived. That required knowledge of the property, of the storm's chaos, and of how to take advantage of both. Attention circled once more toward the family and those closest to them, a tight circle of people who had been there that night, who knew the structure, who had motive or opportunity. But time had done what storms could not. It had eroded proof, blurred memories, and left only fragments too weak to hold in court. Interviews were repeated, questions sharpened, but the answers had grown practiced over the years. The father maintained his silence, avoiding speculation, refusing to relive details. The mother pressed for justice, but her grief often drowned out her words. Relatives distanced themselves, some refusing to cooperate, others leaning on the absence of direct evidence. The case became a puzzle with missing pieces, enough to outline an image, but not enough to name its source. Prosecutors reviewed the findings, but stopped short of charges. Without physical evidence tying a person to the act, the case would not survive a trial. The announcement landed heavily on the community. For 12 years, they had lived with mystery. Now, they had answers to where and how, but not to who or why. The truth had been revealed, but only in fragments, leaving the most painful questions unresolved. The family fractured under the weight. The father remained on the property, living in the shadow of the collapsed barn, his silence read by many as guilt or despair. The mother moved between relatives, unable to bear the sight of the land that had concealed her daughter all those years. Their marriage, once strained by theories and blame, dissolved into distance, For them, the revelation was both an ending and a sentence, confirmation of loss without the comfort of justice. The town, too, carried the scar. The storm that had once been remembered as fierce weather was now retold as the cover for something darker. Parents warned children about walking alone, not because of rain or thunder, but because of what people could do under the protection of chaos. The barn became a symbol of betrayal, its fall marking the moment when silence gave way to truth, but truth that offered no closure. People gathered at its ruins sometimes, staring into the space where the cellar had been, each of them wondering the same thing: who had known, and how had they kept it hidden for so long? The sheriff's office left the case open but inactive, a file resting among other cold cases, marked by conclusions but not convictions. Detectives admitted privately that the storm had given someone cover, and the collapse had given them exposure. But between those bookends lay 12 years of silence that could never be undone. Evidence had slipped away with time, leaving suspicion where proof should have been. In the end, the barn's collapse revealed the truth of where the girl had gone, but it did not answer why she had been silenced or who had ensured she stayed hidden. The community was left with a haunting certainty that someone among them had carried that secret through storms, seasons, and years, never speaking, never breaking. And that silence, more than the storm itself, was what would haunt the valley forever.